Thank you very much for this contribution. I would like to give immediately the floor to Mr. Flaherty, who is the Director for the EU Fundamental Rights Agency.
Thank you very much, Chair. Marie-Hélène, thank you for inviting the agency to participate today. Through you, may I also express appreciation to the Commission for its sustained work and to Lena in the last days of her responsibilities in this area. Thank you so much for the space you've given for the Fundamental Rights Agency and those committed to a human rights approach in this important struggle. I'd like to express my own appreciation to the Slovak presidency for the leadership you've shown over the last few months in moving these issues up the agenda. We owe you a great debt of gratitude. And let me finally, by way of opening, congratulate Valeru on his appointment and wish him all the very best in this important role at the Council of Europe. I'm here today to present the findings of our latest survey dealing with the issue of the situation of Roma. It's a situation of Europe's largest minority group, a group which has suffered dramatic levels of exclusion and marginalisation across generations in a context of general hostility from the general population in so many countries of the European Union. One of the difficulties in dealing with these issues historically has been the lack of solid data. This is because general population surveys have tended not to focus on the particular experience of what it's like to live as Roma in Europe. And that is the context behind the high priority that the Fundamental Rights Agency has given and will continue to give to this issue. The results that I'm announcing to you today represent findings of the third major survey by the agency. The first one done already nearly 10 years ago, at the beginning of the life of the agency, a second, more targeted examination in 2011, and then today. Today we're publishing the Roma results from a much larger survey on the situation of minorities in Europe, known as EU-2. And we will roll out other elements of the -2 findings in the course of 2017. But let me get straight to the Roma dimension. Firstly, a brief word on the methodology. We conducted face-to-face interviews with almost 8,000 people who self-identify as Roma, and they were able to represent the views of almost 34,000 households. And through the scientific application of sampling methodologies, they were able to give a very accurate sense of what is the lived experience of being Roma today in Europe. And again, the concentration was on 9 carefully chosen member states, again applying various technical methodologies to ensure that we got the best possible voice based on adequate sampling surveys that could be available to us in the European Union. Look, before I get started on results, let me just say at the outset the results are shocking. We've heard words of optimism this morning, which I endorse. I agree that we're getting some things right, we're going to some extent in the right direction, but the starting point is really disturbing. I warned them that my PowerPoint would collapse, and that's exactly what's happening. Can somebody change? Thank you. I want to start with figures for poverty. I'll tell you why. Many years ago, the then UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she was asked, what's the primordial violation of rights? The violation that triggers all the other violations. And people expected many answers from her, but she surprised them. She said poverty. Poverty is the primordial violation because it takes the ground from under you to enjoy just about every other dimension of your life. And so the figure of 80% of people averaged across the EU living below the at-risk of poverty level is disturbing. It's all the more shocking when we match that against the at-risk of poverty level for the general population, which is 17%. So the at-risk of poverty levels 4 times higher if you are Roma. The figures are very disturbing in some states. The at-risk of poverty level for Roma in Spain, 98%, more or less everybody. Greece, 96%. Croatia, 93%. Then, unpacking, what does it mean to be poor? There's many elements of this in the survey results here in the room, but just to give you one, and that is the issue of hunger. So we asked the question, in how many of your households did somebody go to bed hungry within the last 30 days? The answer across the average of the EU was 27%. And from one country, Greece, 47%. Almost half of the Roma surveyed in Greece reported that somebody in their home went to bed hungry at least once in the previous month. Housing. Could we go back, please? This thing is losing. There we go. Housing. Issues of housing and access to safe, clean drinking water are fundamental for human dignity. They preoccupied a lot of the debate at the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's important to ask, in Europe, what's our situation? Well, the survey results are there before you. 33% do not have running water at home, and 46%, nearly half, do not have an indoor toilet that they can access in the home. Thank you. Then turning to education. Well, here again, there's a little nugget of good news here, but I don't want to overplay it because I don't want to misrepresent this as a good news story. It's not. But we do have improvements in terms of Roma children in preschool. We have half, which is still dramatically less than the general population. But if you must look for progress, if you must find an achievement, we can point to it here. That's the end of the good news when it comes to education. Only half of Roma in secondary school. And if you're not in secondary school, what chance do you have of a decent job? What chance do you have of further education? And in fact, I find the figure very frightening of those who go to some form of third-level training or education, 5%. One other issue of education has to do with segregation. Now, segregation is illegal as a matter of EU law and as a matter of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. And we're not suggesting that there is any policy of segregation anywhere. Nevertheless, we found unacceptably high rates of what I will call de facto segregation, either in separate schools or in separate schoolroom communities. What are the figures? Just to give you three. The Roma, again, we're referring to the views indicated to us by the surveyed Roma. In Slovakia, 62% identified segregation. Hungary, 61%. Bulgaria, 60%. Staying with young people and moving more generally to youth. Youth we define as anybody between the ages of 16 and 24, 16 and 24. And we ask the question, how many of these people are either in education or in a job? When we asked the question, we were aware that the general population figure for youth who are not in school or a job is 12%. 12% in the general population, 63% in the Roma community. Moving on more generally to employment, 30% in paid work, 30% in paid work, as opposed to an EU general population figure of 70%. Now, as I say, there are so many more details in the survey, which is available here, but let me just pick one element further with regard to work. The image is chosen deliberately because it refers to the kind of work we're talking about, to the extent we're talking about work in many cases. Hard, physical, exposed to risk. And therefore, issues of healthcare immediately come into play. And with regard to healthcare, we found that only 26% of the surveyed Roma had access to either public or private healthcare schemes, essentially just a quarter. We asked about general experiences of discrimination, and the figure was low, lower than you'd expect. 41% reported some incident in the past 5 years. I don't think that's a true figure. That's a figure based on a personal sense of when I was discriminated against. And that's a problem, because we also know from other questions that there's a very low level of awareness of rights. A very low level of awareness that this doesn't have to happen to me. I shouldn't be treated like this. And then when the bad stuff happens, a shockingly low perception of where to go to complain. You see the figures up there on the screen, with 82% not knowing about organisations that could stand up for them. So I would suggest these figures are more telling than the discrimination figures to capture the experience of discrimination and exclusion in the community. But enough of these survey results. Let me conclude my few observations with some suggestions as to where we might go to build from this very low base to make a meaningful difference. Firstly, we have some pretty good policies. The EU Framework for National Roma Integration Strategies, the 2013 Council regulations, the way in which ex-ante conditionality is built into the ESFI Regulation 2013, they're not bad. They have a very important role to play. And sorry, for those of you not familiar with Irish English, not bad is a compliment. It's a confusing way we speak. There's a lot of good material there. It's a case of implementing it. So the first obvious recommendation is not to reconstruct the policy framework at the EU level from zero, not at all. But blow the dust off the covers, get more serious about implementing. And I'm referring here to the level of member states. I'm not particularly referring to the level of the Commission or to the other institutions of the Union. Second, never lose sight that this is the stuff of human rights. This is not about generosity. This is not about philanthropy. This is not about the kindness of the Union. This is about fundamental human rights. Roma rights are human rights are Roma rights. And Roma must insist and demand a respect for their rights. In order for those of you who represent Roma communities here to stand up for your rights, you need the data. That is why the surveys are being done. That's why we're presenting the findings today. But we can't do it alone. And in particular, at the level of member states, we need a much better job to be done of disaggregating so that we know the actual experience of Roma member state by member state. Now, as was mentioned earlier by the plenipotentiary, there are some issues around disaggregating by ethnicity in some member states, and we must work with those member states to find ways around these impediments, because without the knowledge, we can't fix the problems. Staying with the issue of human rights, I believe, or we believe, the agency is of the view that national human rights bodies, such as human rights commissions, human rights institutions, and equality bodies, need to become more engaged. For example, we would like to see a stronger representation of human rights and equality bodies in the monitoring committees for the ESIF funds. This is a reluctance at the level of the human rights community that we need to encourage to overcome. It's critical that Roma be further supported in the process of empowerment so that they can demand their own rights and their entitlements. I pay particular attention to the empowerment of women this afternoon, and you might wonder why. I haven't spoken of women until now, given the brevity of my presentation, but if you read our report on issue after issue, where we disaggregated the experience of women as opposed to that of men, women came out worse. Women came out worse in education opportunities, in job opportunities, you name it. Wherever we asked the question, women came out worse, and it's obvious to us that focusing supports for empowerment on women in Roma communities will make a significant difference. We have to tackle poverty. We've got to put poverty at the top of national agendas. We have to recognise that the poverty levels in Roma communities are a significant impediment to the making of progress, and so the poverty of that community must somehow leapfrog to the top of the priority list for member states. We need to end the de facto school segregation. There is experience from other sectors. We know how to break down de facto segregation. We've done it before in other contexts. And so it's a matter of bringing it much further up the policy priorities of decision makers. And finally, and I'm very glad that the Council of Europe representative spoke of anti-Gypsyism. We have to acknowledge the extent to which the problems we're discussing are underlined, are supported, are fed, are nourished, prove difficult to get rid of because of racism. Anti-Gypsyism, marginalisation and pushing of Roma to the margins of our society is quite simply racist. And we have to tackle that deep-rooted racism in our societies from many different directions. I'll just give two and then I'll finish. One is using the criminal law. When hate speech and when hate acts cross the line of criminal accountability, we need to do a better job of prosecuting them. And the Fundamental Rights Agency has seen a rise in the pattern of these forms of attack on minorities, including Roma, over the past year. But we have not seen a commensurate rise in the level of investigation, prosecution and imposition of criminal penalties. I'm not, by the way, calling for a criminalisation of everything. I'm calling for a better implementation of existing law in this context. And finally, if I may, for those of us here who are from the general population and not the Roma population, we have to identify the racism inside ourselves. We don't even know we have it. But across generations, we have lived with such an attitude of superiority and condescension towards Roma that even if we willfully disavow it today, we have to acknowledge that it still feeds some very fundamentals of how we think and act. We've recognized this with regard to gender. We've recognized that we sometimes discriminate on the basis of gender unconsciously. I would say everybody up here has taken a course on unconscious gender discrimination. We need to take similar action, put a similar focus of attention on the unconscious racism deep inside us, which so hinders our efforts to work with our Roma brothers and sisters to get past the problems we're discussing today. Thank you.